So a warm welcome to everybody here at the ALT Online Winter Conference 2020. My name is Mara Deepwell and I'm the Chief Executive of the Association. And it's my pleasure this morning to facilitate this discussion, our opening plenary on a new ethical framework for learning technology. Now, as part of ALT's strategic aim to strengthen the recognition and representation for learning technology professionals from all sectors, one of the priorities our members identified for this year is to develop an ethical framework for learning technology. The ethical use of learning technology and data has been a real key focus for many organizations as online and blended learning is scaled up. And in a moment, I'll be inviting my fellow panelists to discuss a number of questions around this new framework. But first, I just wanted to give a little bit of background in terms of building on ALT's professional accreditation framework, CMALT, which was last year expanded to include ethical considerations for professional practice. Our initial aim for this project is to establish a practical checklist that can be used as a starting point to inform the ethical use of learning technology by professionals, institutions, and also industry. We feel that as a professional body, we've identified that the need for such a framework has become increasingly urgent as learning technology has been adopted on a larger scale than ever before. And as the leading professional body for learning technology in the UK, representing around 3,500 members, we feel that ALT is well placed to lead this effort. Building on this initial checklist and the outline framework, we'll develop a full framework with input from members next year, including working with commercial organizations who are members to road test the framework with industry. There is ample opportunity to get involved and stay informed about this particular piece of work. And we're going to put a link in the chat to where you can sign up to do so if you haven't already done so. So if you'd like to find out more and get involved with this project, please do. This is just the beginning of what I think is going to be a particularly exciting piece of work. But now, without further ado, I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to come and join the conversation. So we're going to, I think, go for a round of introductions to see everybody gets to speak, and we're going to switch our cameras on and all be on stage together. So Bella, I'd like to welcome you on stage first and ask you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Maren. Hopefully you can hear me and not the very noisy builders that I have knocking my house downstairs. I'm going to be fast on the mute button. My name is Bella Abrams. I am the IT Director at the University of Sheffield.
Fantastic.
Also, sorry, I should probably mention that I'm also a trustee of ALT. So yes, I'll mention that too. Apologies.
Excellent, thank you. And one of our other trustees is here as well. Sharon, welcome. Oh, we can't hear you yet, Sharon.
Hi, Maren. Apologies. I've been having some problems with my headset this morning and I can't seem to turn my camera on for some reason, but I'll give that a go in a second. Delighted to be here this morning. As you mentioned, yes, I'm one of the trustees of ALT. I also work with the Irish Universities Association, where I am project manager of the Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning project. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel today.
Fantastic, Sharon. We're delighted that you're here with us. And actually, I wanted to welcome you as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and particularly delighted to have a fellow CMALT holder here on the panel with me today.
Hi, Maren. Hi. Thank you so much for having me, especially on this panel. I'm a training manager at the North Anglia Education at the moment, although I've worked in FE and HE all my life. Right now, my focus is on primary and secondary school teachers in international schools. So I'm very excited to talk about today's topic.
Fantastic, and we can see you as well. Welcome. And next up, we've got Natalie Lafferty. Hello, Natalie.
Hello, Maren, and good morning, everyone. And yes, like everyone else, it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I head up the digital education team in the Centre for Innovation, Technology and Learning at the University of Dundee. And I'm also an ALT trustee and really looking forward to the discussion this morning.
Great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. There's a particular reason why we have 3 of our trustees joining this, just because our Board of Trustees is taking a very active role in helping to support the work of this particular working group, and Bella, Sharon and Natalie jointly lead this working group. So it's a privilege to have you all with us here this morning. Thank you. And we're also delighted to welcome John to the panel. John has, I think, been one of the longest standing champions of this piece of work in ALT. So welcome, John.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great to see so much progress. And good morning, everyone. I'm a Professor of Digital Learning at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm particularly interested in informal learning, digital learning amongst disadvantaged and development communities. I guess that's sometimes the perspective I bring to it.
Thanks, John. Delighted to have you with us. So now that we're all welcomed, I'm just going to stop sharing the panel screen, and we're going to be able to all see our speakers on screen. If you haven't already discovered it, there is a little icon on the top of your Blackboard where you can decide how you see people within the frame. So hopefully you'll be able to see whoever is speaking most easily. So the first question we're going to be discussing this morning is focused around the biggest issues emerging in ethical approaches to online and blended learning and teaching, particularly in this year of the pandemic, where we've been really forced to confront so many issues around scaling up learning technology. So I wanted to maybe come to Bella first, and then open up the panels to all panelists as questions. Well, how do you feel? What are the biggest issues in your context emerging in ethical approaches to online and blended learning and teaching? Bella, are you happy to kick us off?
I am, thank you, Maren. I'm really sorry, the drilling is really going, so if it's too much, maybe we should swap someone out. But so I have been thinking a lot about this for a whole host of reasons as a trustee of ALT, but particularly actually in my role as IT director in a university. I think often there is an assumption that people that work in IT, not just learning technology, but people that work in IT are often jumping to the new and the shiny without thinking about what the impact that the new and the shiny may have on our customers, our stakeholders, students, staff, etc. I also have a slight background in ethics. I did study at university a little bit, and I live with an actual ethicist. So that's a big part of a lot of our conversations. So bringing those two things together, my work in IT and my partner's work in ethics, is where these two things intersect. I mean, back to the question. I think that products, systems, learning, teaching are often developed with many things in mind. New ways of working, meeting expectations of staff, the available technology, the new and the shiny. And often I think these things are laudable, but if we only look at it like that, then we're likely to miss a huge amount of things that are absolutely critical for delivering outcomes to our students and our staff. Some of the things that I had down, and I'm sure everyone will talk more broadly about this, are around inclusivity in its broadest sense. So not just accessibility, which is the legal one that everybody jumps to, but actually building genuinely inclusive services. And that includes a lot of bias and making things as free as bias as possible. And we've seen obviously some really difficult things happening in that space as well. The big concern, and I think GDPR covers some of this, is privacy, but actually the technology gives us a huge amount of potential for surveillance of staff and students, and that, from an ethical perspective, really needs to be brought into the sunlight and discussed at length institutionally and amongst staff and students. I think there's also something that we maybe should be concerned about long term, which is once we've built those services and we've launched them and people are using them, can they be misused in future? Could we start looking at them in a different way? And again, predicting what we might want to use them for is something that we could consider as well. I also think there's a lot around structural design of universities, colleges, schools, that will impact services as they're developed, but also things will change as time passes. The Office for Students have got a huge interest in data, and the fact that we're using lots of services and products that collect that data, they could then change the governmental design, and that might breach what we actually built that service for. The other thing that I'm really concerned about, and this is probably what a lot of you are thinking about, is our reliance on private companies to undertake ethical and data assessments. And relying on people to do that in the background, I think, is very worrying. And I also think we really need to consider what free actually is. If we are using something that's free, is there an ethical price to pay? So those were the things I was thinking are the biggest issues that are emerging at the moment. And hopefully the drilling was not too bad.
Thanks, Bella. We could hear you loud and clear. I couldn't detect a drill at all. So to all of you who are joining the conference amidst building work, our commiserations. That's brought us off to a flying start. Thank you. I'd like to give the opportunity now maybe to Sharon and then to Natalie and Laishi to come in. So Sharon, would you like to share your thoughts next?
Sure. Great opening there by Bella, and I wonder what else we can add to that. It's quite difficult. I noticed yesterday morning in particular, I suppose a lot of us every Monday morning we arrive in and one of the first emails we see is from Office 365 letting us know how much we've been collaborating with people or working on emails, or how much time we have for productivity. And I suppose it's that sort of productivity scoring that can be a little bit concerning, because certainly when I look at that email on a Monday morning, I don't recognize what it's telling me, and to be honest, I don't bother too much about it. So I suppose I kind of have the option to be able to opt out of looking at it. And that's one of the things that bothers me, is this power relationship with students, because a lot of our students don't have the option to opt out. In fact, do they have the option at all to opt out of the surveillance which is going on, and that sort of constant monitoring? I think that it's disquieting for students, and it can raise anxiety levels if it's not used in the right way. And I suppose one of the things that bothers me is around who determines what the ideal student behaviour is. Where is that coming from? Is it an algorithm? And do those algorithms discriminate against certain types of students, or certain ways that students can behave? So that's one of the things that bothers me, is this automation and the inability for students to be able to say, actually, I don't want this, I want to opt out. For example, do students have a right not to be proctored if they're taking an exam? And why not? And the other thing which I suppose is connected to that, and I won't go on too long, is that very often the terms and conditions are very much written in a language that is confusing, and many of us don't read those terms and conditions anyway. They're written by lawyers, for lawyers, to protect people, and it's not the students that are being protected by it. So one thing that I'd certainly like to see is a simplification of those terms and conditions, and maybe written in English language so that they can be more easily understood. I'll stop there, and I'll let other people come in.
Are you still on mute, Maureen? Has anyone else lost Maureen? Is it just me?
Yeah, I've lost her as well.
Okay, I'm going to take over. Natalie, do you want to do your bit?
Thanks very much, Bella. I'd really echo a lot of what you've already said, and also what Sharon has said. And I think for me, one of the real issues that's been a sort of symptom in the whole response to the pandemic is actually time to think. So we're making decisions about technology very, very quickly without really maybe always considering them. And I know that one of the things that we have done in my own institution is develop a set of digital principles, and one of those is about trust and integrity, and that we will ensure reliability and ethical use of data and ensure privacy. But it's actually the time to think about these things, and Sharon touched on things like proctoring, and it has been quite perturbing, I think, to hear some of the stories from students and their experiences of the kind of surveillance culture. But also, interestingly, I think, again, it's proctoring is also highlighting some of the biases. We had this letter just the other week from senators in Connecticut to ExamSoft and other proctoring services, just highlighting how these services actually discriminate against those with disabilities, people of colour. There are so many levels of complexity, I think, in all of this. And I always find it fascinating that when Mozilla do their annual surveys, there was one a few years ago which was about the general public's kind of perception of privacy and ethics when it comes to digital and data. And those that are most concerned are actually those who work in the digital domain, whereas maybe the public at large aren't so conscious of some of these issues. So there's almost I think a sense in which we have a duty to almost develop that sort of data literacy and ethical understanding of our students and our colleagues about, you know, how digital could be misused. You know, as Bella mentioned, you know, if we've got that ethical framework, it should protect us from people who maybe have ulterior motives in the future and might want to do things which are very anti-ethical. And I guess, having worked in medical education for many years, I'm very conscious that there, when they were developing Caldecott 2, which was a consultation around medical ethics, and you may be aware that the NHS has something called Caldecott Guardians, and their responsibility is very much to protect data on patients. And when they consulted patients, patients very much felt that actually surely the NHS are using data to enhance patient outcomes and also patient safety. What they did not want is the NHS giving their data to big pharma and to insurance companies. And I think, in a sense, I've heard my colleagues in medicine may say for many years, where medicine has been, higher education and education generally is following maybe 10 years behind. And I think we're kind of meeting that intersection right now, that many of the issues that our colleagues in healthcare faced are now ones that we have to sort of face up to, I think, in higher education. And maybe we can learn a bit from them as we try to develop these frameworks that are going to really help to inform our practice.
Thank you.
Maren, you're back. Fab.
Yes, I am. The tech gods had just a little blip for me to make my morning interesting. But actually, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to come into the conversation now and maybe share your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody said so many things that, you know, I keep nodding here and agreeing with. Like, I can't put it, you know, any better than this. But for professional and personal interests, I'm going to focus on school-age children because that's what my focus is, with my teachers at the moment. But I suppose the same applies for adults in education and in the workplace. Even before COVID and the world going completely digital, we were concerned about the time our children spend online on digital devices. But then it was mostly what they did outside of school for fun, with being online was the main issue. But now the explosion of homeschooling and everyone jumping on board with that tech, I feel there may be the danger of overexposure to technology. As a learning technologist, at first, this really excites me. Finally, everybody's paying attention to what we've been saying about EdTech can make your lessons better and all that. But also as a parent, thinking about especially young children, are they mentally and physically prepared to deal with the demands of technology embedded almost completely in our lives now? In the past few months especially, have we prepared them to stay safe online? Are we capable? Are they capable of understanding the need to stay safe online? If not, how do we make sure they are? Do parents have the know-how to help? Have we taught our students to behave responsibly enough online, especially different age groups? What's their quality of life now? Is it better or worse with more exposure to technology now that they are using it for learning more than they used to ever before? And on the other hand, I would also want to think about fair access. So not everybody's going to have easy access to devices or infrastructure or even skills. So how will they cope with everybody learning and working remotely? This applies to both teachers and students. So for example, if a teacher, some teachers will find it easy to deliver a lesson remotely. They have the skills, they have the space to do it. Now imagine a teacher who had young children at home with them. Delivering a live lesson remotely is a whole new ball game. They might have equipment, they might have skills, but then their stress levels, right? This applies to adult learners as well. Trying to manage learning from home as well as managing home. So throw in to this lack of skills or confidence, you can imagine the frustration and the stress levels of these individuals now. On the other side, imagine the frustration of the students logged on to this lesson, not to mention parents. I'm thinking about all days. We've got hundreds of schools with young children at the moment, all learning online, where parents have to support them. So all around, not a great experience for anyone if they are pressured to keep going digital. So framework, I think, which applies to all these individuals, which I'll probably come into in the next question with context, I think will be really welcome.
Thank you. And I can see from the chat that what you said and what you all said really resonates with the people in the room. And we'll come on to practical examples in a moment, but I want to bring John into the conversation. I think John has reconnected now. So, John, what are your thoughts on the emerging issues?
Sorry. Done it.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Right, sorry about that. I think I'm to some extent starting at the other end, because my principal concern is actually worrying about what constitutes harm. I mean, especially as so much of this stuff, what we do and how we do it, is rapidly evolving, and actually it's connecting us to different cultures and different communities where harm may have different meanings. So it's partly that. I mean, I learned a while ago there was not only the golden rule, which is the one about do unto others as you would, whatever it is, but apparently a platinum one, which is about do unto others like they have done to themselves, as it were. And it's reversing the telescope, as it were, and looking at things from other people's perspectives. I mean, I'm delighted to hear all of these other issues because I think they help, as it were, populate the bottom up. And if I were to contribute to that part of it, it's very difficult to avoid coming at it from my own work. And that's digital learning overseas and the research that underpins it. And so I'm conscious of the movement or the calls to decolonize research and what that might mean in practice. You know, in practice, it might mean I have to think about how to run focus groups or interviews in ethical ways in the light of these emerging concerns. But actually then recognizing that some of those cultural concerns about decolonizing research actually might be a case of reversal learning, where actually we, in, for example, UK universities, I mean, predominantly white middle class institutions, should worry about how we interact with people who aren't white and middle class and highly educated. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there that is around ethics. And then actually, I suppose recently, well, yeah, for quite a while, some of my work has been around what you might call, I don't know, policy guidance, where the ethical issues, the dilemmas are often actually reconciling what I'd like to advocate with what I think the listeners can actually manage to hear. And maybe knowing what fights to drop, you know, what fights to lose. And I suppose that for me, those are reasons for an ethics framework that is not prescriptive, that talks in general principles, that allows us as professionals to kind of work it out case by case, and, you know, knowing that there is some kind of overarching guidance rather than some detailed prescriptions. So that's me. That made some sense.
Thanks, John, and thank you, everybody. It's been great to see all your different perspectives. I can see that, you know, many people are contributing in the chat, and I hope that we have time to read that as well and bring that into the conversation. If you do have any particular questions for the panel, we're going to open up for questions soon. Please do just add them to me or to Emma Jane out events, and we'll try and pick those up towards the end of the session. But what we'd really like to move on to now is to invite all of our panelists to share some practical examples from their own context of when the need for an ethical framework arises. And I know some of you have already indicated some, but it would be really helpful, I think, to maybe discuss this in more detail. And this time, hopefully, we can change the order around a bit. So maybe if we come to maybe Natalie first and then move on to John, and then we'll bring Bella back into the conversation as well. So Natalie, thinking about the context, in your context, where the need for an ethical framework arises, what would you share as a practical example of that?
What would I share as a so I think, for example, I've got colleagues who are clamoring to move to proctoring. We haven't used proctoring. We've had a long history at Dundee of running online exams, and obviously this year we've moved from 20% to 100%. But there are some who are asking about proctoring. Also, as we've moved to more and more e-resources, I've had colleagues contact me who are using McGraw-Hill resources, who seem to have a link in with Proctorio, who are then sort of pushing, you know, would you like to have a free trial of this particular software? And so I think some people just think, oh, this is a solution, let's just crack on with it. But I think, having thought a little bit about ethical, you know, the ethics of all of this, we as a team have kind of cautioned against it. And I think what this whole situation has done, we've had this kind of small exams assessment group working, and we've come up with a recommendation that actually we need an ethical framework. So I think the fact that some of us have had this kind of in our minds, and I remember last year at the Alt Board meeting, we were discussing this, and it's come from the community. So I think those of us sort of having that awareness of the wider issues that are at play here, have the opportunity to highlight that we need this, and other academics, I think, are grasping that too. And so it's allowing us to just slow things down and let's make some considered decisions. So although we don't yet have that framework, we've got these principles, and one of those is that we're going to deal with things ethically. So in that stopgap, we're just having a bit of a pause there. And I think that then helps us to avoid some of the horror stories that I've heard from other institutions around proctoring.
Thank you, Natalie, that's really helpful. And I know that tomorrow at the assessment plenary, which is tomorrow afternoon, this is one of the areas where we want to, I think, particularly focus on the questions around assessment, proctoring, or alternative forms of assessment. So maybe we can come back to John now and then bring Bella into the conversation. John, you mentioned a few contexts already, but could you share maybe a specific practical example of where you think this new framework could be applicable in your context?
Oh yeah, a couple. One's quite generic, as it were, and it relates back to hearing many years ago that actually Facebook was the third largest country in the world. And that, you know, in other countries they do things differently there. And so I'm concerned about maybe the educators' responsibility to go into that country and to all of the communities in that country, and to maybe worry about our concern as educators in terms of, as it were, outreach into that country or those countries out there in, cyberspace, quote unquote, and connect with those communities. But then that tells me that those communities are probably characterized by having different ethical values from us in our country or our community. And, you know, that might be characterized by different ways to interact, different ideas about what constitutes a joke, what constitutes intrusive behavior, what's a priority and what's a triviality. How do you gain acceptance? What are okay ways to interact? So that's a kind of general question in terms of perceptions of harm in those other worlds. If you want something specific, then there's a kind of ongoing liberal dilemma, if you like, about how do you, to what extent do you teach or online or engage in, for example, Saudi Arabia, or maybe China, I don't know. You know, I'm sure we can all choose our own examples. Saudi Arabia is kind of close, not close to my heart, but close to my head, maybe. You know, to what extent do you engage hoping to promote change, or to what extent do you stand back or wash your hands of it? and that just goes on and on for me year after year.
Thanks, John. We'll bring Bella back in, and then we'll come to Laishi and then Sharon. Bella, any practical examples in your context where you think this new framework could be applicable?
China. So John gave me a lead in. Obviously, the COVID pandemic meant a considerable number of the University of Sheffield students who come from China were in China at the beginning of term, and we worked with Alibaba and JISC to put a service in to allow those students to access our teaching and learning. But the real question for us as an institution, which did go all the way up to the top of the institution, was what duty of care do we have towards those students who are undertaking teaching and learning in their home country where surveillance is the norm? And that is something where I think actually it was a real opportunity for us as an institution to have those conversations at senior levels and to not blindly go into allowing the technology to do the things without thinking about what that actually means pedagogically and from a duty of care to our students. So that's something that we really thought carefully about. I think the other thing someone's put in the chat about pushing back against solutionization. One of the key examples that I really chafe against in my working life are, and I'm lucky because I am a senior member of the university, so I have the opportunity to push back, but pushing back against senior stakeholders who've been sold a solution, not actually thinking about what the problem is. And I think that that's something that this framework or not just a framework, but having principles that are signed up to by ourselves as members of a professional body, but also by our institutions and influencing our institutions to use these principles in a framework to allow us to select technology and to think about the platform and our students wherever they are and our duty of care to them.
Thanks, Bella. And I think there's a couple of really interesting questions coming up in the chat. So after we've heard from Laishi and Sharon, I think we'll go and pick up some of these questions. So Laishi, can we bring you back into the conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a great segue, China, to bring my next example up, because we've got lots of schools in China, international schools in China, and I work daily with teachers online. My morning is spent talking to international teachers, supporting them using technology, because there's lots of pressure to use this in their teaching daily, constantly. People are very tech oriented. Parents are constantly on the phones checking up on what the kids are doing. So I think the teachers, first of all, I'm going to talk about it in two different views. From the teacher's point of view, they need guidance of how to use learning technology so that it enhances the learning while having a positive impact on the student quality of life, a student experience. How to strike a balance where online activities are great, but what work can the student be set, for example, to investigate and design offline, learning can start and end with technology, but everything that we do in between without using a platform, learning can happen anywhere. We talk about it all the time, in the classroom, in the lab, in the garden, in the kitchen, wherever. But if the teachers are given a framework to guide them to make these choices so that the learning experience is a more wholesome one, so that they can actually deal with the pressures that are put on them to keep using technology and in larger quantities, if you will. That brings me to the stakeholders and the business aspect of it. From where I stand, I'm in London Central, where the decisions are filtered down to our schools. So a framework, I think, would be important so that the pressures to go digital that's put on the teachers are sensible, and we as an organization will understand how to strike a balance between going digital and the quality of life of the student and the teacher, as well as keeping up with the pressures, the outside pressures to keep learning, to keep delivering, and then from the IT and the learning technology teams point of view, it'll be good for us learning technologists to be able to prepare and mentor teachers of the ethical use of technology in the classroom, as well as doing what we do best by showing teachers all the wonders of technology and, you know, all the toys that's available. But it'll be good if we had a framework to so that we can mentor these teachers to provide guidance on how to use the technology so they can keep doing their wonderful teaching activities.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, really helpful perspectives. Thank you. Sharon, shall we come into you as well and see if there's any particular examples that you have in your context?
Thanks, Maren. Well, I suppose for me, the biggest one at the moment is proctoring, which Natalie has already mentioned. So I might go to the kind of the second one that was on my list, which is around student analytics and the use of VLE data. And it's kind of a difficult one because we know that we do need to be able to keep an eye on our students. We have a duty of care towards our students. But there is this fine line between care and surveillance. It's like two sides of a coin. And I suppose it's just trying to be aware of the motivations and the differences between that. I started off this morning speaking about the email that you get from Office 365 about your productivity data. And yet there was some worrying information, I suppose, certainly on social media recently, that maybe this data, this individual personalized data, can be rolled up into a dashboard for employers, so that your employer can monitor just how productive you are being. And I suppose I'm just a little bit concerned about what exactly is being measured, because we tend to measure the things that are easy to measure rather than thinking about how useful they can be or what meaning we can take out of them. So I would be worried about the analytics that are being collected, asking the question, you know, for whom are they being collected? Is it for the students so that they can monitor themselves, and yet then are we trying to measure them against some sort of a normalized or ideal student or average student, and what exactly does that mean? And I think also there is a wealth of data which already exists in the VLE, say at a module level, but many of our academic staff don't know it's there. They don't know how to access it. They don't know how to use it. So I think maybe it comes back a little bit to what some of the other panel members were talking about earlier around that sort of creeping automation, the creeping features that, you know, very often we've already bought into a VLE, but it's been improved all the time, you know, new features being added. So maybe we're not always aware of exactly what's being collected or how it's being used. And I think Helen Beetham mentioned in the chat there, it's really hard to keep up with the chat and the panel, but about the sort of negative consequences of some of the technology that we're using. And so I think that having the ethical framework there may be able to really help us to start the discussions around this. So yeah, that's my tuppence worth anyway.
Thank you, Sharon. We have a whole host of interesting questions in the chat, and I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who are contributing. And, you know, we'll have a couple of particular points that I wanted to bring up, so I'm just going to share those with my panelists now. I think it was Helen who raised the point about the UK leaving the EU and the potential conflict or confusion that could cause in terms of the current rights that are already enshrined in European law for us. And I guess the somehow the implications of the work that we're doing in terms of legal frameworks. And in relation to that, I think one of our other colleagues it has brought up the question of whether there is going to be scope to engage more specifically with professional bodies, particularly, I guess, when it comes to the context of assessment. And then there were two other questions that were specifically raised. One, Barry Cruz, I think, just brought up in relation to, I think, a really big question, how we can approach the global nature of the delivery of courses and programs when our response, particularly to COVID, has been so UK focused and UK centric, but in reality we are working with students and staff based all over the world. And I think in this context, challenging ourselves how decolonizing the curriculum meaningfully can be done in this context is a big question. But maybe we'll leave that one to the end, and first maybe pick up some of the questions around the sort of practical engagement with other professional bodies and also the implications for legal frameworks. I wonder if anybody in particular from the panel wants to come into that. You could either raise your hand or just jump in if you wanted to start picking up one of those. Bella, I wonder if you had any thoughts particularly around the implications of the legal frameworks. Yes, please.
So I worry a lot about GDPR because it's a worrying thing. I think at the moment my understanding is that GDPR has been moved into UK legislation and then it'll be subject to change based on all manner of things, probably Dominic Cummings's views on completely changing data analytics and other things. I think institutions and us as members of institutions probably need to keep an eye on the shape of what's happening legally and often probably push back against it. I think the worry that I've seen is we always move to respond to legal concerns, but if they are, I don't know if many of us have seen those deteriorate from a legislative point of view. They've often increased in recent times. So I think, again, thinking about a framework and ethical principles that we as learning technologists have, we could use them to push back against any reduction in legal frameworks as they emerge.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Bella. Natalie, you mentioned sort of working in a medical context, particularly also. I wonder if you had any thoughts on, scope to work with professional bodies or ways in which, this project could maybe bring those perspectives in.
Yeah, Maren, I think I've said for many years, because so many of us are dealing with professional degree programs, and our courses are regulated by these professional bodies, and often their view of assessment is actually quite outdated, or they adopt this solutionism approach that Bella was talking about, where they just want to do what they've always done, but use technology in that way, rather than maybe rethinking and reimagining what assessment should look like in the 21st century. And it seems to me that it's these professional bodies that are really pushing the proctoring solutions. So I just wonder whether there is an opportunity for ALT to engage with some of these professional bodies and open up that conversation. There was a piece by Bonnie Stewart on The Conversation the other week about some of these law exams, some horror stories. And I think particularly, the General Dental Council, my colleagues are really concerned about their approach. They're always very, very tough and strict. I think colleagues in medicine are recognising that proctoring still can be gamed and cheated. So I think there are some who don't see it as a sort of magic bullet. But I think there's scope for us, I think, and across the ALT community, we're dealing with engineers, computing, architecture, nursing, all these professions, education. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to sort of grasp and have those conversations with them, because I do suspect they're not thinking about it. Because I think for many, and there's that sense almost in which I think maybe 10, 12 years ago, we were kind of techno-evangelists. Now I think we're all techno-cautionists, if that's the right word, because we're becoming aware of these wider issues and the complexities.
That leads us really well into one of the questions, I think, from Jen Ross, which was around the future misuse of, or at least the unintended consequences of technology. So how should we be talking about this in a context of something like an ethical framework? I wonder if anybody from the panel particularly wants to jump into that question. Just going to leave it open. Yeah, John, please.
Well, it's something I find myself saying frequently, that in the international development community, we hear about unexpected consequences all the time. It's a kind of almost a cliche to avoid having to explain anything, really. But it does make ethical decision making very problematic. If you don't know how things are going to play out and work out and end up, and you're still trying to make an ethical decision, it's really, really tough. But I guess actually that's, again, I keep coming back to the need for general principles, where there isn't a prescription or a tick list or a cookbook, but actually the best you can do as a professional is the best you can do as a professional. You know, it's your experience and expertise, and that's the best you can do. So yeah, that's one contribution.
Thanks, John. And I am really mindful of that. You know, there's a lot of asks, I think, that we all have on making things better. And I guess what we can do, as you say, as a professional body is to provide a central core around which then the application of this in different contexts can be led by members and other professionals. We have two more questions that I wanted to bring in. One from Mary Cruz around how we can raise awareness of decolonizing the curriculum in this context, and also one from David Jennings around whether it'll be practical to go down the path of examples like mydex.org, where individuals own and control their own data, including licensing subsets of it to tutors, examiners, and prospective employers, etc. So I think these are the two questions we still have time for. Any of my panelists would like to come in on Mary Cruz's question, so I'm just going to read that out in full. I think it was John who mentioned the importance of including other cultures' perspective when designing an ethical framework, which is often ignored. How can we raise this awareness of decolonizing the curriculum when supporting the new hybrid blended models that universities have introduced as a response to COVID-19? I found that this model, the perception of professional staff involved supporting them, tend to be completely UK-centric when our audiences are global and our campuses international. So I know John wants to come back into that, and then we'll see if any of our other colleagues want to come in as well. John?
I think I don't want to overstate the case or simplify the case for, if you like, protecting or enhancing individual cultures or languages or communities, because clearly there ought to be some kind of critical balance made on an ethical basis between doing that, as I say, enhancing or preserving other people's cultures, languages, actually their pedagogies, the way they learn and what they value learning, with quite possibly their need to access the opportunities of the globalized, corporatized, digitized outer world. But then clearly that takes me back to, yes, you can't do that without some overriding principle, which might be we should all be promoting equity, or we should all be promoting self-determination, or something of that sort that can help you reason through the specifics.
Thank you, John. That's really helpful. Anyone else from the panel? Bella, you want to come in? Yes, please.
I want to echo John's point, actually. I think I was noodling around thinking about the framework, and I think the framework's absolutely critically important to what we do, but I think it's the second step after having the principles, because the principles, which I think we all vehemently agree on, we just haven't necessarily written down, are setting a framework within the context of those principles, like John talks about, almost the philosophical principles as opposed to the technological or teaching principles. And then we can think about how that works for us. The other thing that I kind of wanted to reflect on as well is I genuinely think institutions really want support with this. I don't think we're pushing at a closed door if we develop ethical principles and a framework. And I think that's something we should kind of remember in confidence, that actually as a professional body and the amount of discussion that we've had today, that is going to be echoed around the sector. And I think we should seize that moment and kind of take it for what it is.
Thanks, Bella. That's really helpful. Natalie wants to come in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that's kind of alarmed me is Bella was talking about our students in China. And I think it's this issue of we're dealing with students who live in a surveillance culture, who are afraid to raise concerns about their course, about the technology when it's not working. And you see the impact that it has on these students, that they're struggling and we don't know because they don't feel they can tell us, because if they do, they could, be penalised by their government. And I think it's a sort of stark warning in a sense. I mean, that's an extreme what's going on in China, but I think it's understanding that the importance of having these frameworks and understanding also that what's going on in other cultures, because it's playing out in how they live their relationship with our institutions, and how they're able to succeed in our programs. So I'm not sure if I'm really articulating this very well, but it's really kind of caused me some concern. And I think some staff don't understand why is it these students won't complain, because they have no understanding of the kind of the social contract in China and how that could limit their ability to travel and all this sort of thing. So there's a kind of piece of education to do, I think, to make sure that our colleagues in professional services and our academics are really, aware of the kind of consequences of some of the lack of ethics in other cultures that then sort of dampens the individual.
Thank you. Natalie, you wanted to come in, and then we'll go to Sharon last. Thank you.
Yeah, just echoing what everybody else said, the importance of considering other cultures in this framework, while being flexible enough to move across age groups and FE, HE, school, whatever. I think considering what's important in each culture, it's not that they wouldn't think of it ethically. That ethics might be looked at differently than we do. So what's important in, for example, the parents in China love having apps, but in our Swiss schools, parents don't really care about that. So what the type of technologies and how we communicate with our students and our teachers and parents, I think it also depends on the culture. So being aware of their needs and what they hold important, I think will be key.
Thank you. That is really helpful, and just a reminder of how much of a global undertaking professional practice in learning technology can often be. Sharon, I'm aware we haven't brought you into the conversation, and we have a few moments left. Would you like to add your final point?
Sure. I suppose just listening to some of the other panel members, and I wouldn't have the same experience of perhaps working with other cultures, but it seems to me that we need to start from a position of respect and look at our values, and we need to use those to inform this ethical framework that we are attempting to build. And I think maybe one of the other things is to ensure that that it can be built collaboratively, that everybody can have a voice in this. And I feel that it's really, really important to, in particular, bring in the student voice on this, wherever the students are based and whoever they are. I feel that student partnership is so important in all aspects of learning technologies, but particularly so here, because I think it has to reflect the values of our institutions and our cultures. So it's a huge task, but I think it's something we need to strive towards.
Thank you, Sharon. And with that inspiring conclusion, I'd like to invite you all to raise your physical or digital hands and give our panel a warm round of applause. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us here at the opening plenary of ALT's Winter Conference. We invite you to please contribute and stay up to date with the work on this ethical framework for learning technology in the new year. And we hope and wish you a really good rest of the day here at the Winter Conference. So thank you, everybody, and see you later.